They're seeking love. We have his voice, but we won't speak. We have his arms, but we won't reach. It doesn't matter what we know if we don't walk where he says go.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Mars Hill Radio, a production of GodsProof.com. And now, here's your host, Jeff Sievertson.
Good evening and welcome to the Mars Hill Radio program. I'm your host, Jeff Sievertson. For those of you that are listening for the first time, the premise of our show is based on Acts chapter 17 of the Bible. This is when the Apostle Paul goes up on Mars Hill to share the gospel of Jesus Christ with the philosophers of Athens. There were the Epicureans, the Stoics, and pretty much anything you can think of. The Athenians liked to hear new things, and Paul was bringing to them something that they had not heard before. Well, after listening to him, there were some that mocked what he had to say, there were others that wanted to hear more, and there were a few that believed. So here on the Mars Hill Radio program, we are, in a sense, doing that same thing, bringing people together that do not believe the same, having a discussion, and letting the audience listen in to that discussion. I, of course, am a born-again Christian. I believe the Bible is the Word of God from Genesis to Revelation, and I do believe that God created all things. Having said that, my guest tonight, and please correct me if I say this wrong, my guest tonight is Julius Csotonyi?
It's Csotonyi.
Oh, okay, Csotonyi.
It's a hard one.
Well, I really messed that one up. Anyway, he's a freelance paleoartist working with various museums to reconstruct life-size murals of various prehistoric animals and ecosystems based on his study of the fossil record. And, of course, I'll let him tell you all the museums his artwork is exhibited at because it's actually quite a long list. And I've actually seen some of your artwork. It looks really great. He also has a scientific background with an M.Sc. in Ecology and Environmental Biology and a Ph.D. in microbiology. He's performed research in biological sciences for 14 years. He's also a published author in various scientific journals. He did actually start out as a fundamentalist, young earth creationist, but over time changed his position, which, of course, I'm going to let him get into and talk about. So having said that, Julius, are you with us?
I am.
Great. Why don't you go ahead and fill in the details on your background that I kind of left out. Talk a bit about your journey from being a creationist to an evolutionist / agnostic-atheist. And then let's discuss some of your research that you believe actually supports evolution as opposed to creation.
All right, sounds good. Thank you very much, Jeff. So, yes, as you had gone through, I've got kind of a bit of a different kind of a background. At the moment, I'm doing mostly paleo artwork, as you mentioned, and so I work with various organizations and paleontologists to create large murals of ecosystems that we can't see anymore. This derives from both my interest in artwork as well as a background in ecology, or the study of the interaction between animals and plants and their environment. This allows us, along with the fossil record, to be able to say something about what these ecosystems looked like. And then it's the work of paleoartists such as myself to give us sort of a visual representation that museums and or books can use to show people what the best idea that we have of these environments. So the other thing is that, of course, as you mentioned, I've got a background in science. At the moment, I'm not very actively involved in science, although I am still actively preparing manuscripts for publication based on my previous research. Most of my time these days is taken up by the paleo art. I recently, last year, acquired a PhD in microbiology, and so that's kind of where a lot of my research recently has taken place. And in that, I'd studied some rather interesting kinds of environments that were a lot of fun to study, anything from the deep ocean, where we have strange interactions between animals and unusual bacteria, and very strange volcanic environments, to flat areas in North America that are salty springs that are more salty than the oceans. You get strange life forms there as well, and even unusual types of interactions between plants and their pollinating insects in the desert, yuccas and yucca moths, for example. So you get some interesting interactions happening in a wide variety of environments, both today and from the fossil record in the past.
So did you actually get to go out to, like, say, look at the thermal vents? Did you get to go down and actually study them there?
Yeah, actually, that was a lot of fun. We took a research vessel, a big ship that took us out to the vents about 200 miles out from Vancouver Island, and we sent a remote-operated submersible down from the ship. And we were in the control room where we could see live what was happening from the video feed at the bottom of the ocean, which is about a mile or two below us. So that was a lot.
Oh, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, it was great. So I felt pretty lucky to be able to be included in this kind of research. And so, so going back, you asked about my background. I was raised in a Bible-believing family, basically, and we had quite a diverse background. We had actually moved through several different churches or denominations while we were involved with a sort of this theistic background. We covered everything from the Jehovah's Witnesses, the Mormons, the Worldwide Church of God, Seventh-day Adventists, an offshoot of the Pentecostal church, something called a Messianic congregation, and then we also eventually ended up doing sort of an independent church gathering of ourselves. And that was for the earlier part of my life. I was quite involved, actually, and I was a very strong Christian, very strong believer. And at the same time, I was also very much interested in science. And in the early days, I didn't have as much information available to me. Over time, though, I did a lot of reading, and I made it a goal that I wanted to become a scientist because I was just so fascinated by this stuff. So I did a lot of reading, mostly in biology, but also covered some areas in other parts of science, everything from physics and a little bit of geology and astronomy and so on. Over time, I ended up going to university where I took this to, as I explained before, and you as well, to do some graduate work, both in ecology and environmental biology, as well as microbiology. And there, of course, I had to look at a lot of the original publications, the scientific publications that scientists actually have to put out about their research in journals that are, excuse the thunder in the background, that scientists publish in research journals that are reviewed by their peers, and after a pretty lengthy back and forth of revision and review, many of these ones are published. And so I looked at a lot of this original research. Over time, starting out, as I mentioned, I was a young Earth creationist, so I guess most of your viewers will probably be familiar with the idea that this is the ideology that the Earth is, no more than maybe 6,000 or so years old, and that it was created specially by an intelligent agent. That was what I had believed. And then over time, as I increased the amount of reading that I did in science and became familiar with what the actual scientists were publishing based on the research that they were actually doing, I started to find problems with this view, and over time gradually went through several stages through sort of like an old Earth creationist idea that maybe, okay, well, everything was created, but it was created longer ago than would be suggested by a literal interpretation of Genesis, and then eventually to sort of something more of a deist, where I thought maybe there's some sort of a divine influence in things, but nothing really well defined. And at the moment, I would probably best define myself, if you wanted to look at it sort of theologically, I would say, or knowledge-wise versus theology, I would call myself probably an agnostic-atheist. And what that means is that there are two components there. The first one, agnostic, comes from sort of a root nostos, which refers to knowledge. And agnostic is a person who does not believe that there does not have any knowledge, does not purport to have any knowledge for sure one way or the other about something. So in other words, is open-minded. An atheist is somebody who simply doesn't have a belief system, doesn't believe strongly about something, isn't confident about something without evidence for it. So, in other words, I don't say that I know absolutely that there is a God or no God, but I am withholding any kind of judgment on it simply because I don't see any evidence for it.
Okay. Since you grew up, like you told us, you went from Jehovah's Witness to Mormon to Pentecostal to kind of through that whole thing. Is your family still consider themselves Christian, or have they moved away from it as well?
Well, there's a variety, sort of a range, and so some of my family is still rather strongly believing. Other members are a bit more, kind of less connected with it. So there's kind of a range of that. I would say that I am probably the most sort of the polar opposite of what I was initially, I guess.
Oh, okay. Do you guys? Because sometimes I have family that believes, of course, differently than I do, and whenever we get together, we tend to avoid those subject areas.
Sure.
Just because in the past it just becomes heated. Is that kind of how it is, or do you guys have an open dialogue about all of it?
It's kind of a variety. With some of them, I kind of try to avoid it a little bit because I know that it's something that could be a point of a bit of tension, and I don't see that there's any reason to cause the tension. With others, we're pretty much open to talk about it, and I think that the reason for this and the reason that I get along with my family is because, first of all, we're all pretty accepting in general. We're not in the past. I mean, I've been to several organizations where they've been very, very insular and have very much we're closed-minded to, and we're not open to accepting other people. My family is generally not so much like that. But the other reason that I think that we get along pretty well is because I've got no problem with a person believing something for themselves if, for example, it helps them emotionally to deal with stress and so on. There are many people that believe things that we cannot test one way or the other, and I'm going to defend everybody's right to believe whatever they wish. Furthermore, I don't have a problem with people who believe in a God or some sort of supernatural aspect to the universe, and even who are scientists at the same time, but manage to compartmentalize their belief system separately from their scientific research activity. Okay, so as long as they're able to keep the belief system of untestable ideas separate from what they work in science, I have no problem with that. I've met some really great scientists, or I know of some scientists that are also theist. At the same time, the problem for me arises when somebody when they cross the bridge and enter into the arena of science, and for people who would introduce a theistic bias into the, say, scientific research or into education, that's where I have a problem with it, and that's where I would have arguments in general. And in general, we don't have that kind of an issue with my family. We just kind of keep things in a nice, sort of comfortable, friendly manner, because I don't see any reason to cause divisions between people. I think it's best not to burn bridges, and in general, why should we not get along? And I also kind of hold that for discussions with theists in general. I mean, I have a background where I know where they're coming from in many cases, because I knew how it was to believe in a certain way. The only difference is that the way I think now is that I won't accept something unless I have some kind of evidence for it. And in general, as a scientist, I'm trained to accept ideas to an extent that's proportional to the amount and quality of evidence that's presented in its favor.
Well, that's a good point you bring up about as you talk about science, because in my arguments with different folks, the way that they kind of define science is slightly different for them. So how do you define, when you say science, how do you define the term science?
Okay, well, I mean, we're looking at as rational and objective a way possible to elucidate how the world works around us. And now everybody, to some extent, has what's called confirmation bias, right? So in other words, we tend to look for things that agree and with what we hold to be true. We often hold certain things to be more true than others for various reasons, sometimes emotional, sometimes not. But the scientific method was devised partly to minimize the amount of confirmation bias that goes into investigating the world. So science is a way of generating testable hypotheses, which are basically questions about the world, some aspect of the world, some specific aspect, and then carrying out as unbiased and objective a study as possible to determine whether or not a particular hypothesis is supported further or whether it can be refuted. And
so something that's basically testable and repeatable.
Yes, testability is important. Repeatability is important. Among the different studies that we can do, if a lot of our results tend to support one particular larger, model or explanation about how a certain aspect of the universe works, it tends to graduate into what's known as a theory. And this is one of the things I'd like to actually clear up a little bit, is that you frequently encounter the term, especially regarding evolution these days, because there's so much talk about it back and forth, that evolution is just a theory, right?
Okay. Now, see, I'm actually glad you said that as a scientist, because when I had conversations with Beth and some other atheists that were at the debate that we had, Beth was promoting a book by, I think it was a scientist, that said evolution is not a theory, it's a fact.
Well, it's both, actually.
Okay,
so I'll explain it.
Tell me the difference between, as you explain
it. Sure. Sounds good. Evolution is a theory in the sense that there have been many studies done using the scientific method in various ways, generation of hypotheses that are then tested in the field or in laboratories, and the results of those have overwhelmingly supported what has been supported a general view of the world, a general explanation of how life has changed over time on Earth. And because so many of these studies have supported this particular model, this model now, this theory, this body of evidence that is explanatory and predictive, is among one of the best supported theories out there. A theory is an explanatory body of evidence or model that is built on many hypotheses, all having supported it. In other words, the results have been positive for what was being investigated. In other words, if you hypothesize that, for example, looking for a particular evidence for a certain kind of an animal, a certain transition, for example, between two types of animals, and you look in a particular location based on geological information, and you expect to find some kind of a form, and then you go out to the field, look for it, and then you find it. This helps to support. This is a positive. How shall I explain? It's a hypothesis that was supported by the results, as opposed to being refuted. So if you have many of these kinds of investigations, and there are many different kinds of investigations into evolution, when many of them support the same model, then the theory that grows out of it is very strong. So in other words, a theory is kind of the best that a scientific idea can hope to become effectively. So in that sense, it's not just a theory. Now, the other side of it, you can say that evolution is also a fact, and Jerry Coyne actually wrote a book. I think you're referring probably to that one.
I think it might be.
It's Why Evolution is True by Jerry Coyne. And he does describe evolution also as a fact. In that sense, we can actually observe evolution taking place. We look at some of the tenets of evolution that, for example, one of the major roots of evolution is natural selection. we can actually perform experiments to show that natural selection is taking place in real time. In that sense, if you define evolution as change through time, and more specifically, if we apply natural selection, then a change in the frequency of certain traits that are genetically encoded over time due to environmental selection pressures, selecting for particular kinds of traits from a variable population, then we can say that at least these aspects of evolution are in fact.
Well, like for example, which you just brought up, natural selection. A lot of atheists don't know that creationists actually agree with that portion of it, that there is a variation within a species. Of course, if you look at all the different dogs, you realize you can breed certain kind of dogs that they may not be able to breed physically, but you can, through in vitro fertilization or something, you can breed them together. But what is your argument against a creationist who says, well, natural selection is only a variation within a species. It's not jumping from one species to another over a long periods of time.
Yeah, but we do see examples of speciation taking place, and I'm not talking about simply dogs. For example, as you mentioned, yes, dogs can interbreed, and of course there are several different species concepts in biology. One of them involves, the model that species are defined by reproductively isolated units or populations, right, that cannot interbreed. And dogs, in that sense, would not, the different breeds of dogs wouldn't fit the description of different species because they can breed with each other. However, there are examples of other species that have been studied where reproductive isolation has been recorded to take place in them.
Yeah, I know there's been some examples of different types of rabbits, some that live far north and some that live far south, where they cannot actually interbreed anymore.
Yeah, something like that.
Is that what you're referring to?
This is the kind of thing. A good example of something like this would be ring species, for example. And it's a neat example of a series of populations where you can see speciation effectively having taken place. So, for example, salamanders in California, there are two species of them that meet around a central basin and that do not interbreed, cannot interbreed, but around this basin there is gene flow taking place. In other words, there is interbreeding between adjacent populations, and there's a whole series of these adjacent populations all around the basin that do interbreed with each other, in the sense that locally adjacent populations, any pair of them or any group of them nearby will interbreed, and therefore genes can flow between them, but the two populations that have met after they have spread around this basin have differentiated so much genetically that they do not anymore interbreed. Okay, so this is an example of a ring species. There are several of these examples. The rabbit one might be one. There are bird species as well in North America like this. And this is one nice example where you can actually sort of see what likely happened.
So other than species of similar kind, like rabbits or birds or ring species, that can no longer interbreed, what is something else that you look at that says that we know things are evolving? Is the fossil record one of those things that you look to say, yes, we can tell over time things have changed?
Yes, yeah, that's one of them. But before I get to the fossil record, I'd like to point at one really neat example of something, actually. And I don't know if you are familiar with, there's actually three examples of this in the world known so far, and we'll probably find more of them as time goes on. But in 1951, a woman by the name of Henrietta Lacks developed cervical cancer, and it was a very nasty form of it. It actually ended up in her passing away within the year. However, the cancer cells themselves were cultured, and they were maintained in a living culture, and they had developed certain mutations that do not cause the kind of cell death that most human cells exhibit as a form of protection against tumor formation, for example. And a whole bunch of other things actually happened as well. The whole genome duplicated, and in fact, in a more complex way as well, it actually now has over 80 chromosomes instead of our usual 46. So what's ended up happening is this organism now, it's still alive in cultures. It is genetically quite different from humans. It is unicellular. It doesn't form a fully functional human. It basically grows as single cells, which may or may not sometimes come together in groups in various ways. But it is independent. It doesn't absolutely require a human host. It can be grown on its own in the same way that bacteria can be grown. Two other examples of this kind of a thing happening are what's called canine transmissible venereal tumor, and there's also a devil facial tumor, which is found in the Tasmanian devil, which is actually threatening the population or the entire species of Tasmanian devils. And in both cases, we have an organism, a parasitic cancer that has mutated in various ways and has become effectively an independent organism. It's going to be very difficult to classify this thing because it is genetically in some way similar to its ancestors, and in some cases we absolutely know what its ancestors were, but it is now a completely different kind of organism. A lot of people will say this is a new species, and it does in many ways qualify as a new species. Of course, taxonomically, or in other words, in classification, it's going to be difficult. But we have here what could easily be looked at as kind of an example of macroevolution, as some people like to call it. I don't like the terms micro and macroevolution because they introduce an unrealistic a distinction between or an unrealistic sort of gap between ways in which evolution can occur. What we're looking at in terms of macro versus microevolution, as people term it, is actually evolution taking place in ways that require either a small amount or a large amount of time or sort of genetic modification. So in terms of biologists, we don't really have much of a use for the terms of micro versus macroevolution. There is, some people do use it, but I personally don't like it myself. But if you want to look at it from the point of view of people who, you hear a lot the question, well, can you show a huge difference in organisms in terms of evolution? Well, here's an example. Other ones are polyploidy in plants, where the entire chromosome set will duplicate more than once sometimes. It happened in animals as well in several cases. In fact, it's hypothesized that all of vertebrates have had a duplication of their genome at one point. This is one of the major mechanisms probably by which evolution takes place and increases information in the genome. But this large change in the shape or morphology and the genetic structure of an organism is a wonderful example of one form of evolution taking place. Not all of it is that sudden, but there are examples like this, for example.
Well, for example, I was listening to a documentary. It's called The Atheist Tapes, and it was just a British filmmaker that was interviewing several atheists, and one of them was Richard Dawkins. Mm-hmm. And he had stated that many of the changes that they see out in nature, most of the modifications or the changes or the mutations are defective in the sense they're harmful, like for what you talked about with cancer. Mm-hmm. Do you see? And he said that he thinks there's a few that are beneficial, but most of them are detrimental. Do you see it the same way as he does, or do you see that there are many beneficial mutations that, like you said, increase information?
See, now here's the interesting thing. First of all, the problem that we have with the discussion of the beneficial versus detrimental is it's very difficult to define what beneficial versus detrimental is. Now, let's take the case in point of this descendant of this woman, Henrietta Lacks. The descendant cells, by the way, are often classified as Heliceiton gartleri. But in any case, how do we define beneficial here? Certainly for her, the mutation was detrimental. Okay, I mean that's pretty obvious. Right?
Yeah,
I mean,
that's pretty clear.
It's very sad. But in terms of the cell line, it becomes a little bit more ambiguous and difficult to define, because these cells grow much faster than her somatic or body cells grew from which they descended. So for these cells, they're actually able to reproduce much more quickly, and therefore, in a sense, you could say that they're more fit. So
you say the cancer cells were more fit than her regular body?
Well, in the sense that they are able to reproduce more quickly, produce more offspring, for example. In that sense, yes. Because they're not limited by some of the things that in particular, has to do with, partly at least, with these structures called telomeres.
Can they,
right?
Can they reproduce on their own, or do they need to have some sort of medium, some sort of
everything needs
something else to...
Yeah, everything needs a medium. Okay, so I mean, you and I need food. All bacteria require certain types of nutrients. Any organism can only live in an environment that provides it with the kinds of nutrients that are necessary to repair its body, build new tissues, and so on. So in that sense, yes, the cells require a medium, but they are no different in that sense from any, let's say, other bacterium. They don't require a host. They don't require a human body in which to grow. As long as they're provided the proper nutrients, they will grow. And you can.
So even though it killed her, you see that this is a possibility of a proof of evolution.
I think that it certainly it killed her. But what we have to look at in terms of how beneficial a genetic modification is for an organism, we have to look at it as what conditions under which it lives, right? So in other words, in this case, there is that artificiality that the people studying the cells are deliberately keeping it alive and are feeding it nutrients. But it is an example where if the environmental conditions change such that a cell that was initially was a part of a multicellular organism now could grow faster if it was on its own. If there was a pool where these nutrients were provided, or a host where these nutrients were provided, then for that organism it is beneficial. And we can look at this particular case as sort of artificial, but the two others, the canine transmissible venereal tumor for dogs, and the devil facial tumor in Tasmanian devils, arose independently of human interference and is now spreading through the populations very quickly.
Now you said, correct me if I'm wrong, but you had said that the cells that were cancerous, that were growing faster than the host and the woman, you seem to speak of them as if they were beneficial or better.
No. I'm sorry. They're not better for the individual. That is clear. When I'm talking about beneficial, we always have to look at it from the perspective of sort of the unit organism. Okay. So in other words, the benefit must be looked at from the point of view of these individual cells. For the cells, because you and I are made up of many different cells, right? Or many cells, and in general they work together pretty well. But if one of them sort of becomes independent in that sense, doesn't anymore work in the community, becomes cancerous, then those cells are effectively independent of our body in a sense. Okay, so they still require the body to live in, but then so does any other parasite, even if it is a different species living within some other species host. So in that sense, like for example, the devil facial tumor in Tasmanian devils, it's a parasitic cell that descended from the Tasmanian devil and grows within the Tasmanian devil population, but is independent. So it doesn't only grow in one individual. It can be transmitted from one individual to another, and effectively behaves in the same way as any other parasitic organism. And in that sense, I would say, it qualifies as something that has evolved in a different way. Very unusual way, for sure. But for those cells, from their point of view, not to anthropomorphize it, but technically from their point of view, they are actually less limited in their reproductive rate than the cells of the organisms from which they descended. And of course, there's all sorts of little, details that we can add to that. But by and large, when we consider any given cell within an organism versus these particular cells, these cells are reproducing with less limitation and could be considered, more fit as independent organisms.
So I guess, because I'm thinking about, the theory of evolution and the idea that we came from simple-celled, single-celled organisms, and we continually, became multi-celled, and then went from fish onto the land, and then walking upright and thinking and that sort of thing. So how is this example of cancer being an example of a beneficial, or a good example of evolving from a lesser? From a lesser or a lower order to a higher order.
Okay, so that's a different kind of a thing here. Okay, what we're looking at here is we were just talking about the emergence potentially of a new species. Okay, so this illustrates that kind of a thing well. Okay. It also kind of lays some of the groundwork for discussing evolution of greater, I don't know if I want to say complexity, because many organisms are complex, and it's difficult to say one organism is more complex than another. Organisms are all very well selected for a particular environment in which they live in many cases. But for the kind of change that you see from single-celled organisms, let's say, to multicellular organisms, or from earlier life forms, various kinds of aquatic vertebrates, such as some groups of fish, to terrestrial or land-dwelling tetrapods, these four-legged animals, for example. We do see some of the groundwork potentially also in these cancer cells, and I don't want to dwell on this so much because it's not the best example. But I mentioned that you do have what's called polyploidy, or duplication of a genome, and when this happens, when the chromosomes or some of the genes of an organism duplicate, okay, so sometimes you have this happen where all of the chromosomes will duplicate or some of the genes will duplicate, then what you have is a redundant set, okay, so you have like 2 copies, for example, sometimes more. Recently there's some new work on pox viruses where they've shown to evolve rapidly because they really highly multiply certain genes that help them to counter the material with which we fight them. Anyway, when we have this duplication, this redundancy, now you have 2 copies, let's say, of a gene that performs a function transcribed into a certain protein, which then performs an actual function physically. If one of these copies mutates, then it is more free, essentially, to mutate if there is a duplicate copy still performing the original function. And if this then allows mutations to change rather radically the duplicate copies. And so, for example, these like the devil facial tumor or the canine version, if they duplicate their cells, or at least in the case of this Heloslyton, you have now the potential to actually increase the amount of genetic material and probably complexity as well in the organism over time. Because if you mutate a gene that's necessary for an organism's survival, and there's only one copy of it, that organism will probably suffer or in some cases die because it's lost a certain function. But if it has duplicated first and then the mutation takes place, then of course the organism is effectively covered. And we see this kind of duplication of genes followed by mutation to lead to, if we look at the phylogeny or the way in which organisms' genomes are related to each other, we see that certain genes have very likely evolved from duplicate copies of other genes.
Now, let me jump in here with a quick question. Now, you're looking at things from an evolutionary, agnostic, atheistic point of view as a scientist. You're saying evolution should be doing these things, and then you take a look at, the cancer cells or the parasite that grows on the face of the Tasmanian devil, and you're saying that this is making changes within the genome and within the genetic structure, so this is evidence to show that it's shifting from one to another. From the creationist point of view, it says, of course, you understand the creationist point of view, that we say, well, the genetic makeup of that cell or whatever, it's actually, like, for example, cancer, because it's detrimental to the host. It's actually a mutation in the gene that is a downward moving away from protecting the host to actually killing it. So it's not actually evidence for evolution. It's actually evidence for a corrupt, fallen world that's fallen apart.
The cancer, as I mentioned, was only brought up as an example of potentially, one form of maybe a speciation event, possibly. Like I said, I don't want to dwell on it as a way to explain how say organisms can become more complex. They may.
Oh, I understand. I just wanted to.
The genes duplicated, it's possibly laying the groundwork. But what I was going to get into after this was that there are examples where very likely what ended up happening is that gene duplication has resulted in some incredibly, or some really nice increase in some kind of either complexity or certain capabilities of organisms. I'll give you an example of some research that has been done recently that is actually quite interesting. And keep in mind, before I get into that what we're seeing nowadays is molecular biology and evolutionary biology is older than molecular biology in a sense, because of course it's based on things like the fossil record as well, and we knew a lot more about the fossil record quite a bit before we started to learn about subcellular components. But
just to jump in here real quick, after this example, if we could jump into the fossil record, because there was something that came up during our Facebook discussion, and I brought up a quote that was given by Colin Patterson, and you had mentioned on Facebook you were going to cover that. And I think we just, how conversations go, they go all over the place. So after you finish this, if we could, I'd like to read this short excerpt from the article for the audience, and then let you give us your comments, because we're coming up on about 40 minutes of time, and we got 60 minutes.
And there you could probably speak for hours and hours about this. We've only scratched the surface of what's out there. That's
why I said, when I told you before, we can boil the ocean if we try.
Exactly.
So.
Okay, so one example, there has been some recent work done on some of the mutations that have likely taken place in humans in the past that are very likely responsible for our current level of intelligence, for example, and based on molecular clocks, and we can get into that another time maybe in greater detail, but has to do with calibrating a certain rate of change of mutation in certain genes with the fossil record, and therefore determining how long ago a certain gene probably mutated to its current state. There is a protein in humans that, and in other species as well, that's responsible for the branching of neurons, for example, in the brain. And this protein, it appeared based on a molecular clock analysis. This protein is called SRGAP2. About 2.4 million years ago,
Julius, just to let you know, I think you're scraping your microphone.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Is that any better?
Yeah,
okay,
there you go.
I'll try to say. So this protein, about very likely 2.4 or so million years ago, the genes for it duplicated partially, and the new version, which is now a composite of the old gene with a partial copy of the new one, has actually resulted very likely in the increased length and branching of neurons in the brain, which is interesting because this time coincides with, based on the fossil record, the time at which the cranium of ancestral humans began a large growth spurt. And so we may actually be seeing one of the mutations and the mechanism by which it occurred or in other words, the change genetically, the mechanism by which it occurred, that led to a part of our increase in intelligence, for example. So there's an example of something that could very well be one of the beneficial mutations in the sense of increasing intelligence. There are many other examples of this out there. That's just one, but we're not going to have time to cover too many of these kinds of things. There is also similar evolution in colobine monkeys that have to do with digestion based on duplication of a gene followed by its modification that allows them to have a more vegetarian habit and so on.
Okay.
So anyway, that's kind of some of the examples. I'd love to get into some more of it, but yeah, I know we're running a bit short on time.
That's fine. Yeah, that's fine. Like I said, it's hard to just narrow it down.
Yeah,
but like I said, I'm going to read this. It's a short article. I'll read it as fast as I can, just basically for the audience. You're already familiar with it, but for the audience, just to let them know what we're talking about. The article was taken out of, it was published out of the Apologetics Press, Sensible Science by Bert Thomas, Ph.D. It said on November 5th, 1981, the late Colin Patterson, who at the time was the senior paleontologist at the British Museum of Natural History in London, the editor of the professional journal published by the museum and one of the world's foremost fossil experts, delivered a public address to his evolutionist colleagues at the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. In his speech, Dr. Patterson astonished his colleagues when he stated that he had been kicking around non-evolutionary or anti-evolutionary ideas for about 18 months, as he went on to describe it. He said, "One morning I woke up and something had happened in the night, and it struck me that I had been working on this stuff for 20 years and there was not one thing I knew about it. That's quite a shock to learn that one can be misled so long. Either there was something wrong with me or there was something wrong with evolutionary theory." Dr. Patterson said he knew there was nothing wrong with him, so he started asking various individuals and groups a simple question. "Can you tell me anything you know about evolution, any one thing that is true?" He said he tried that question on the geology staff at the Field Museum of Natural History, and the only answer he got was silence. He tried it on the evolutionary morphology seminar at the University of Chicago, a very prestigious body of evolutionists, and all he got there was silence for a long time, and eventually one person said, "I know one thing, it ought not to be taught in high school." He then remarked, "It does seem that the level of knowledge about evolution is remarkably shallow. We know it ought not to be taught in high school, and that's all we know about it." Dr. Patterson went on to say, "Then I woke up and realized that all my life I had been duped into taking evolution as revealed truth in some way. But more important, he termed evolution an anti-theory that produced anti-knowledge. He also suggested that the explanatory value of the hypothesis is nil, and that evolution theory is a void that was has the function of knowledge but conveys none. To use Patterson's wording, I feel that the effects of hypothesis of common ancestry and systematics has not been merely boring, not just a lack of knowledge. I think it has been positively anti-knowledge." Dr. Patterson made it clear, as I wish to do here, that he had no fondness for the creationist position, yet he did refer to his stance as anti-evolutionary, which was quite a change for a man who had authored several books, one of which was titled simply Evolution, in the field that he later acknowledged was capable of producing anti-knowledge. Creationist Luther Sunderland wrote to Dr. Patterson inquiring why he had not shown one single photograph of a transitional fossil in his book. Patterson then wrote back with the following amazing confession, which was reproduced in its entirety in Sutherland's book, Darwin's Enigma. It says, "I fully agree with your comments on the lack of direct illustration of evolutionary transitions in my book. If I knew of any fossil or living, I would certainly have included them. You suggest that an artist should be used to visualize such transformations, but where would he get the information from? I could not honestly provide it, and if I were to leave it to the artistic license, would that not mislead the reader?" He went on to say, "Yet Gould, or Stephen Jay Gould, the now deceased professor of paleontology from Harvard University, and the American Museum people are hard to contradict when they say there are no transitional forms or transitional fossils. They say that I should at least show a photo of the fossil from which each type of organism was derived. I will lay it on the line. There is no one such fossil for which one could make a watertight argument." That's the end. So my question to you is, I know you've been in the field for quite some time, but when somebody like Dr. Colin Patterson makes those kind of statements and he says them in front of a group of other evolutionists, what is your response to that?
Well, there are several responses there, actually. But first of all, the idea that he'd asked these questions about, what do you know about evolution to many people, and all he got was silence. I would certainly like to see a lot more backing of where this was that this actually occurred and how many people actually responded this way. I can't imagine how people would respond this way. I could respond a whole lot different ways. The other thing is this was done a while ago. The other thing is I'm not sure exactly. I know that a lot of these kind of things are taken out of context. For example, Stephen Jay Gould and Eldridge wrote a paper in 1970s about the punctuated equilibrium idea, and I know that a lot of people get that wrong. Actually, they were talking about speciation, allopatric speciation, which is in other words species being born effectively born. Let's just use that term. Arising in different environments, not in the same environment. So you wouldn't expect to see the kind of gradual transition that you see. But they're talking about individual species, not larger forms.
Well, just kind of like to jump in with punctuated equilibrium. They wrote a book for a children's book. It was called The Wonderful Egg, and it was a dinosaur that laid an egg, and out came a bird.
Well, okay, it's not that simple, really, and I'm sure that that if this was written by them, I'd have to look into this some more. That is not likely. That's not representative of what scientists hypothesize here. It's not that simple. It's not like something gives rise to something else. There is some. Usually there's a lot of gradual transition that takes place. Not necessarily always. Remember, I brought up the examples of, for example, the facial tumor in Tasmanian devils, or polyploidian plants giving rise to new species effectively instantaneously. Sometimes hybridization does the same thing. So you do have some exceptions where new species that are remarkably different from their ancestors do actually arise very quickly. But that's not necessarily the rule. And Stephen Jay Gould and Eldridge were looking at some examples where there may be discontinuities in the fossil record. There are many reasons for discontinuities, some of which, and this is very obvious, is that a lot of the material was probably either eroded or the material wasn't preserved. I mean, fossilization is a very spotty process. It requires so many different kinds of things to go right that that it's amazing how much we do have. And as for the comment that there are no transitional forms, no, that's entirely wrong. There are beautiful transitions of many different groups of animals from one group to the other. And when people say this, it simply results from a lack of knowledge. I guess that's
one of the reasons why I want. Can I jump in real quick?
Yeah, sure.
One of the reasons I wanted to bring that up is because this actually came up in my debate with Beth. It was the email debate we had back and forth. And if you want to know where the information came from, you can take a look. It's in the ebook on my website at godsproof.com. It's called When Laymen Debate. And I had gone to a couple of websites, and I documented in the book there where there were evolutionists that agreed, yes, this was said, this were his comments, but they were mostly focusing on systematics.
Yes, that's part of it, and it was also recorded illegally and so on. Yes, it was taken
hold on just
context.
A second. But with Sunderland, he did write to him, and that was his response.
Okay, so let's just
so that's why I didn't use. I know you say that everybody says that there's no evidence from the fossil record, but that's why I didn't use any creationist position. I was using Dr. Colin Patterson, who was but again, the individual was somebody who was the senior paleontologist at the British Museum.
There are many people that over the course of their lives can change some of their views. I'm not very familiar with Patterson. But the reason why we can't rely on an individual alone, and this is one of the benefits of science, is that it looks at many, many sources of independent information and studies. We cannot, and I have to stress this very strongly, cannot take the word of one individual and focus on it too much. And the reason I say that is some of the stuff he said was absolutely ridiculous if you take it in the context in which it is understood in this case in which you're presenting it. For example, there are wonderful examples of transitional fossils in the fossil record. You look at some of the transitions between, say, one group of radiolarians, which is single-celled organisms with shells, to another group, or foraminifera, which are kind of similar but unrelated. You have, in some cases, 50 million or nearly 50 million year-long transitional series of these things that they gradually change from one form over time into another, and you can see this over many different ocean basins. This is an example of something where you would expect to see gradual change because there's mixing in the ocean as well as a large population and a very long period of time. And in fact, you do see this partly also because this is the place where you would expect fossilization, there are shells falling into the deep ocean, to be more representative of what's actually happened than it is, let's say, on land, where you have so many different processes, predation, decomposition, and so on, leading to a very spotty fossil record. So in this example, you see a wonderful series of transitions. You see that as well between fish to tetrapods in the past. In Patterson's quote, there were, for example, there was much less knowledge known. A wonderful example of predictive science in paleontology involves the discovery of an organism known as Tiktaalik, which is basically a fish but has a lot of tetrapod affinities as well. The scientist led by Neil Shubin, had predicted based on the geological strata and what the environment was like in a particular parts of the world at particular times, based on the age of the rocks, where they should probably find a wonderful sort of a transitional form between fully aquatic fish with fins and then tetrapod animals with limbs, at the time when they were very likely, based on the fossil record again, evolving the limbs that we now possess for ambulation on land. And in fact, based on these predictions, they actually went to these locations in northern Canada, and after 5 years of research, because this is not very easy, so we're looking at enormous areas, and it's amazing if we find something, they actually did find this wonderfully transitional form called Tiktaalik. There are also other species or genera that have now been discovered that bridge various other gaps between certain levels of development of fish fins versus tetrapod, like land-dwelling animal limbs. This is just one example. There's also the transitions, several forms beautifully between earlier reptile forms and the plesiosaurs, mosasaurs, and land-dwelling lizards. A wonderful sort of family tree of relatedness between various forms of mammal-like reptiles, which, as you may or may not know, it's the series that went from something that was much more reptilian to what we now have as mammals, and you see things like the development of the mammalian ear from jaw bones that were originally used in reptiles for hinging the jaw. Beautiful, again, transitional series of these. As well, one of the best and most spectacular changes in shape involved for example, the transition from, or the evolution of land-dwelling hoofed mammals of a certain group that then returned to the ocean and whose descendants were the whales. And you see, again, numerous stages in this transition, in this evolutionary series of land-dwelling animals evolving into aquatic animals. And the fossils that you find line up very nicely in the fossil record at the right times where you would expect to find these. So it's the beautiful chronology of fossils, and not just these, but if you look at the whole world, the level of complexity, the growth of complexity of fossils in the fossil record found in the correct layers that can be dated by radiometric dating. And contrary to what is often produced, radiometric dating is in fact very reliable. I know that there are examples cited of Mount St. Helens and many others that say, well, okay, these recent deposits were dated as much more old. But in fact, this is a very few examples that incidentally, in many cases, have been refuted. When you go to a source, and I would encourage everybody, now it's much more easy to obtain a lot of the original research material, not in the past, but now it is. Go to a website, www.scirus.com. That's SCIRUS.com. This is a search engine made for scientific publications. Now, not all of them are available without a subscription, but many of them are, and they're increasingly so. What I would suggest is enter search terms. For example, if you wanted to look at the radiometric dating, go... We're
actually, just 1 second, yep. We're actually getting really close to the end here. We got about 2 or 3 minutes left.
One sentence I want to finish with that is that if you enter something like, for example, either radiometric dating or in particular, let's say uranium lead, so U/PB, and look at the number of results you get. you'll get like over 22,000 papers. Now, there's some going to be that are redundant, but we're looking at thousands of results, and if you read through those, even the abstracts, you'll find that they support this kind of science extremely well. And you compare that number to some of the few anomalies, again, many of which have been refuted upon closer examination, there's really no argument. And this is why, this is what changed my view. This is, I don't say that it's absolutely, that I know that there's no deities out there and so on, but to me that's incidental. That's not very important, because what I find interesting is what I can measure, what I can look at in the world, and there is an enormous mountain of information that's available to many people now at their fingertips with the internet, from the reputable sources. Look at the original publications. I can't underscore that more heavily. So that's part of it. Maybe we could go on for hours like this, but anyway.
Yeah, we could. Or you could. I could just sit here and listen.
It'd be
But we're at the end of our time. I try to keep it at an hour because you know how attention spans can be nowadays. People keep it short. But one of the things, if you could, send me those web links. I'll put them in the notes for the show at the bottom. And obviously, you know, you and I are not going to solve this. It's going to be an argument and debate that's going to continue on forever.
Oh, people, exactly. There's going to be a lot of, and there should be in science anyway, good debate. That's really important in science.
Yeah, but I really appreciate you coming on. It's great. Thankfully your modem held up through the thunderstorm.
Yes.
So that's good.
Yeah, I'm pretty happy about that too.
Julius, I appreciate it. Is there anything you want to say in closing?
You know what? All I'd say is that keep looking. You know, keep an open mind. Look for information. It's out there. Look at the original publications. I'd say to people, don't just rely on the popular articles, because a lot of them get it wrong, even simple things. But it's been a pleasure being on your show. Thank you very much. And, you know, if we get another chance to do something like this, either this way or in a different way, I'd be happy to.
Okay, great. Thanks. I appreciate it. And for everybody out there listening, if you'd like to become a part of the show, if you like to, like what Julius is doing, just sit across from me or not across. You're in Canada and I'm in Indiana. It's across the border.
Yeah.
If you want to have a discussion, send me an email at marshill@godsproof.com. You can check us out on the web at marshillgp.blogspot.com. I'll put all that up, of course, in the credits so that you can find us. But thanks for joining us. Thanks for joining us, and have a good night.
Thank you.
Seeking